to the reading of The Way Back to Mayberry. Today we read from chapter 16, titled Truth in Advertising. Barney Fife, Realtor. The scripture that goes along with today's the lesson comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. By the title, you might wonder what lesson can be taken from the episode, Barney Fife, Realtor. In this episode, Barney has obviously taken up the real estate game and is already seeing dollar signs. He tries to talk Andy into looking at a larger house, but at first Andy is not interested. However, after more prompting, Andy reconsiders and tells Barney he would like to look at the new house. This action throws Barney into a frenzy, and he immediately finds a prospective buyer for Andy's house. Barney figures that the more people he can move, the more money he will make. An important scene in this episode is when Andy finds Opie attempting to sell his bike to his friend Howie. Andy asks Opie if he has come clean with all the problems with the bike. Opie had not originally planned to tell Howie that the inner tubes were full of patches and the chain had been fixed with wire. Opie questions whether he should have to disclose all the problems with the bike or just assume a buyer beware attitude. Andy tells Opie that he should always be honest when dealing with others. Fast forward to Barney, the realtor. He has the prospective buyers, the Sims, ready to see the Taylor's house. To Barney's dismay, Opie points out several problems with the house in front of the Sims. The evening turns out to be a disaster, and the Sims end up leaving quickly. Andy is convinced that the reason Opie pointed out the flaws is to get back at him for ruining the bike deal. However, upon further examination, Andy realizes that Opie has a legitimate question. Are there different rules for kids and grown-ups as far as honesty is concerned? At first, Andy has trouble answering this question. In the meantime, Barney convinces the Sims to take another look at the house, explaining that Opie has a rather active imagination. Barney states that the problems with the house aren't that serious. Andy now has a choice to make. He can either agree with Barney and dismiss the problems Opie pointed out, or he can be a powerful example to his son by admitting that Opie was pretty much on the mark. Of course, Andy does the right thing and tells the Sims that the house is not perfect, that problems do exist. The telling scene here is Opie's reaction. You can see the relief on Opie's face as he realizes that his father does indeed practice what he preaches. This episode is a pointed lesson on honesty. The scene in which Andy is trying to explain to Opie the difference between houses and bikes is classic. The conversation is obviously uncomfortable for Andy because he begins to realize he can't explain why Opie should come clean with the problems with his bike when he isn't going to be forthcoming with the house's imperfections. In the end, it was just a matter of being honest. But there is another lesson, perhaps not quite as obvious, but important just the same. When the Sims first came to see the Taylor's house, Andy and Aunt Bee were careful to try to cover up all the flaws. They didn't want to admit that the house had problems. Sometimes I think we can have that attitude in our lives as well. It can involve anything in our lives that we don't want to admit is not perfect. Our marriages, our relationships, they all have cracks. But to what extent do we go to hide those cracks so they won't be seen by others? Shortly after we bought our current home, the house next door went up for sale. A few months passed and the house remained empty. One spring afternoon we heard a knock at the back door. A very friendly man named Bobby and his wife Diane had been looking at the house and wanted to meet a few of the neighbors. Bobby, Diane, Nicole, and I immediately hit it off and spent quite a bit of time talking about the neighborhood, the house, etc. After they left, we definitely knew we would love to have these people as our neighbors. A couple of weeks went by and our hope that Bobby and Diane were still interested in the house began to fade. However, one Sunday afternoon as I was leaving to go to town, Bobby and Diane returned with a realtor to take another look at the house. I stopped to say hello, and that's when the yapping started. Nicole and I are the owners of two very large Dalmatians, and no matter how they are portrayed in the movies, Dalmatians aren't nearly as smart or well-behaved as you might think. Anyway, I had started my truck and both dogs began to whine to go for a ride. The longer I talked, the more those two sounded like a couple of hyenas. The male dog, Dylan, wasn't barking. He was emitting this high-pitched whine that sounded more like the mating call of a tropical bird. The female, Samantha, was trying to whine, but she sounded more like a sick cow. Not wanting the new couple to get the wrong idea about our perfectly behaved mutts, I quickly let them out of the backyard and put them on our elevated deck to keep them quiet. It was a nice day, so I told Nicole to keep an eye on them for as long as the couple was looking at the house, and then she could put them back in the yard. Again, my intent was to remove any idea that our dogs would ever be a nuisance. When I returned home a few hours later, I casually asked how long Bobby and Diane had stayed at the house next door. Nicole just looked at me. After asking her what was wrong, she related a story so ridiculous it had to be true. Apparently, Bobby and Diane really gave the house a once-over, and they ended up staying well over an hour. During this time, the dogs began to get restless. Nicole decided enough was enough, so she let the dogs go down the deck stairs to put them up in the backyard. Once the dogs reached the bottom of the stairs, they immediately noticed the new people at the other house. They also noticed the open garage door at the other house. Before Nicole got to the bottom step, Samantha and Dylan were in hot pursuit of the new people. However, they didn't stop at the new people. They ran past the new people and into the open garage. Interestingly enough, the door from the garage to the interior of the house happened to be open as well. So Samantha and Dylan continued their race into the house. All this time, Nicole was giving chase and screaming at the top of her lungs for the dogs to come back. By the time Nicole got to the house, the dogs were running amok through every room downstairs. Dylan was on his way up the stairs to the second floor when she arrived. At this point, even an animal as dense as a Dalmatian knows he is in trouble. However, instead of heeding Nicole's commands to return to the yard, they just sat down, right where they were, on the spot. Nicole was now faced with the task of dragging two 75-pound dogs by the collar out of a house she does not own, in front of a very surprised realtor she does not know, and two very nice people who wouldn't buy this house if their lives depended on it. As I sat there with my mouth open, I could not believe what I had just heard. My whole point in moving the dogs to the deck was to ensure that our prospective neighbors wouldn't get the wrong impression of our silly dogs. But now they surely thought the two canines were wild bohemians. We all want to make good impressions, but sometimes we can try too hard to create those impressions, and sometimes the impressions we try to create aren't really all that accurate, if we're honest with ourselves. In this episode, Andy was also trying to create an impression for Barney, the realtor, and the two prospective buyers. He wanted them to think that his house was perfect. I wanted Bobby and Diane to think that our neighborhood was perfect, including our dogs. Andy realized his mistake and was honest about the flaws in his house. This example of truthfulness and honesty was not lost by Opie. His father's actions made the real impression. Worrying about appearances isn't limited to houses. Appearances are important to us as people. What is more important, however, is to be honest, to be able to admit that we're not perfect and that we have flaws. After all, how successful are we at covering our imperfections? We may be able to fool people for a while, but the truth will eventually come out. It would seem a lot less trouble just to admit that we aren't perfect and let people see us for who we really are. And in most cases, I believe people will like the real us better anyway. What happened to Bobby and Diane? They bought the house anyway, and the 6 of us are getting along just fine. Thanks for reading along with me on this chapter of The Way Back to Mayberry. I'll see you next time.